December 1944. The Hürtgen Forest. American casualties have reached 33,000 in just 3 months. For every mile gained, 500 soldiers die. German snipers control every ridge, every shadow, every breath of wind in this 50-square-mile death trap. The forest has become the single deadliest battlefield on the Western Front, and traditional military doctrine has completely failed. Commanders are desperate. Infantry units are being slaughtered before they can even identify where shots are coming from. And then a coal miner's son from Harlan County, Kentucky, walks into the forest with nothing but a rifle and a box of matches. His name is William Ashworth. His military rank is sergeant. His official role is counter-sniper specialist. But what he is about to do will defy every principle of warfare ever taught at any military academy in the world. In just 96 hours, this unknown rifleman will eliminate 119 German soldiers, using a technique so insane that his own commanders initially thought he had lost his mind. A technique built around a 5-cent wooden match, a 3-second flame, and a psychological trap that German veterans men who had survived Stalingrad and North Africa could not defend against. If you understand what happened in those 4 days, you will understand something profound about warfare that most historians never explain. To truly grasp the genius of what Ashworth accomplished, you first need to understand why the Hürtgen Forest was unlike any battlefield American soldiers had ever encountered. This was not the open fields of France. This was not the hedgerows of Normandy. This was 50 square miles of ancient German forest where trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground, where fog rolled in without warning and stayed for days, where sound bounced unpredictably off tree trunks and ravines, making it impossible to locate the source of gunfire. German commanders had spent months transforming this natural fortress into a killing machine. They had cut invisible firing slits into fallen logs. They had built camouflaged hides that blended perfectly with moss and bark. They had calibrated their shooting angles with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach, every clearing, every path through the woods. American soldiers had a grim saying about the Hürtgen: if it moves, it dies. If it does not move, it still might die. The statistics were horrifying. In November 1944 alone, the 28th Infantry Division suffered 6,184 casualties. That is more than half the division destroyed in a single month. Entire platoons were being wiped out by snipers they never saw. Squad leaders were shot the moment they raised their heads to give orders. Medics were killed trying to reach wounded men who were already dead. The psychological toll was even worse. Soldiers developed a condition called forest madness, a paralyzing fear that made men freeze at any flicker of light or crack of a twig. Replacements arriving in the sector lasted an average of 3 days before becoming casualties. Traditional counter-sniper tactics had failed completely. The standard approach was patience and concealment. Hide better than the enemy. Wait longer than the enemy. Scan the terrain systematically until you spotted a muzzle flash or a silhouette. But German snipers in Hürtgen never gave muzzle flashes. They fired from slits so narrow that light could not escape. They repositioned constantly, never using the same firing position twice. They revealed nothing without purpose. American snipers who tried to outweight them simply became targets themselves. The forest was eating the U.S. Army alive, and no one had a solution. But everything was about to change because of one man that nobody was paying attention to. William Ashworth did not look like a hero. He was quiet, methodical, and had a habit of watching rather than talking. Born in 1919 in Harlan County, Kentucky, he grew up in coal mining country, where life taught lessons that no military academy could replicate. In the mines, survival was not about strength or bravery. It was about recognizing patterns before they killed you. Gas buildup shifts in timber, subtle changes in airflow. These were the warnings that meant the difference between walking out alive or being carried out dead. Young William learned early that the world was dangerous not because it was chaotic, but because it was predictable in ways that most people refused to see. By age 12, he was hunting rabbits in the Kentucky hills. But he did not hunt like other boys. He did not track their bodies through the brush. He studied their reactions, where they froze when startled, when they twitched before bolting, how far they would run based on the direction of the threat. Every shot was preceded by a prediction, not guesswork, calculation. By 17, he described himself not as a marksman, but as a man who watches. That distinction would prove more important than any rifle skill he possessed. When his father died in a mine collapse, Ashworth inherited more than grief. He inherited responsibility for an entire family that depended on his judgment. Awareness was no longer just a survival trait. It became duty. So when World War II came and the army needed bodies, Ashworth was drawn to the rifle not because he enjoyed shooting. He was drawn to it because the sniper role was the purest tool for converting awareness into consequence. At Camp Perry, instructors praised his marksmanship. But what unsettled them was something else entirely. He did not frame problems the way other recruits did, where they asked, "How do I hide?" Ashworth asked what makes an enemy look, where they asked, "How do I avoid detection?" Ashworth asked, "What is the trigger that causes detection?" His instructors dismissed these questions. Sniping, they insisted, was built on patience and invisibility. Let the enemy expose himself. Never manipulate, never bait, never announce your presence. Ashworth did not argue. He simply logged their answers as one more predictable system waiting to be exploited. When he deployed to Europe in 1943, he carried two things: a rifle he trusted, and a quiet belief that doctrine was not scripture. The idea came to Ashworth not as a flash of inspiration, but as a logical conclusion from months of observation. In Normandy, he had achieved 17 confirmed kills, but none came from flashy shots or superior marksmanship. They came from understanding behavioral patterns, tiny deviations in foliage, seconds of hesitation, predictable repositioning timing. He had learned that German snipers were disciplined, but they were also trained, and training created predictability. But in Hürtgen, everything changed. The forest neutralized every conventional tool of observation. No long sight lines, no reliable sound, no obvious firing lanes, no muzzle flashes under the thick canopy. A sniper who relied on stealth was trapped. A sniper who relied on patience was dead weight. A sniper who waited for the enemy to make a mistake was guaranteeing that the Germans would control the outcome. That is when the impossible idea began to form. If German snipers refused to reveal themselves, then what if you could create conditions that forced them to reveal themselves? Not through noise or movement or obvious decoys that any trained soldier would recognize, but through something more fundamental, something so deeply embedded in training that it could not be suppressed. Ashworth analyzed what he knew about German doctrine. Their training emphasized three primary indicators of hostile presence: movement, sound, light. In Hürtgen, movement was nearly impossible to detect in the darkness and fog. Sound was distorted by the terrain bouncing unpredictably off trees and ravines. But light. No matter how small, light remained the one universal trigger. Every soldier, regardless of training, regardless of discipline, regardless of experience, was conditioned to orient toward unexpected light in a dark environment. It was not just training. It was human instinct amplified by military doctrine. And instinct could be hijacked. The idea was simple in concept, but insane in execution. Light a match in a false position. Let the Germans orient toward it. Use their reaction, that predictable half-second of movement, to identify their location, then kill them from a completely different angle. His spotter, Kowalski, thought he had lost his mind. You want to light a match? In sniper territory, that is suicide. No, Ashworth replied calmly. That is prediction. They will react. They will move. And when they move, I will see them. Kowalski stared at him. And if they shoot at the match position, they will shoot at empty air. I will not be there. Only my light will be. No military manual in existence advocated deliberately creating light in combat conditions. Every principle of concealment, every doctrine of survival, screamed that this was wrong. But Ashworth had already identified the flaw in conventional thinking. Traditional doctrine assumed you were hiding from the enemy. But what if you could hide from their reaction to something else? What if the match was not revealing your position, but controlling their position? The first test came at 5:30 a.m. on December 9, 1944. The forest was not just dark, it was structurally hostile. Fog hung thick between the trees, swallowing light and distorting every shadow. German snipers owned every ridge. American infantry had been pinned for days, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to do anything except die slowly. Ashworth crawled into position with Kowalski 70 yards behind him, binoculars ready. Before his spotter could even settle, Ashworth moved 13 steps to a secondary location. Not hidden, not fortified. Just a place that looked plausible. A spot where a careless American sniper might have positioned himself. He pulled the matchbox from his pocket. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. He struck the match. 3 seconds of flame. Then darkness. Kowalski watched the tree line. Nothing moved. 20 seconds passed. 30. 40. Then at 45 seconds, Kowalski saw it. A subtle shift in a brush pile 60 yards to the northeast. No more than a fraction of an inch of movement. But that fractional shift was a head-adjusting angle. A trained response that German doctrine demanded when identifying a potential threat. Ashworth had already repositioned to his real firing nest. He did not need to see a silhouette. He only needed a direction. The Springfield cracked once. A quiet collapse in the brush pile. The first German sniper of the engagement was dead. But what mattered was not the kill. What mattered was the confirmation. German doctrine was intact. German reflexes were intact. German predictability was intact. Ashworth now had the one ingredient snipers rarely obtain: total control over enemy behavior. Kowalski finally whispered, "What the hell are we doing?" Ashworth did not look up. Finding them faster than they can find us. That first kill validated everything. The match was not a weapon. It was a diagnostic tool. It exposed behavior patterns that could be exploited systematically. 20 minutes later, Ashworth repeated the process. Second match. Different location. Different angle. Same result. A German spotter shifted to observe the light source and exposed himself for less than 1 second. 1 second was enough. By noon on December 9th, Ashworth had 6 confirmed kills. 6 enemy snipers who had spent weeks perfecting their concealment, who had survived months of combat, who represented the elite of German marksmanship, eliminated by a man with wooden matches and an understanding of human psychology. By the end of that first day, the count had reached 14 confirmed kills. 14 German soldiers dead because they had obeyed their own training. But Ashworth was not celebrating. He was calculating. The method worked. The system was valid. But the Germans would eventually adapt. They would issue new orders. They would change their doctrine. They would learn to ignore light sources. And when that happened, Ashworth would need to evolve. He already knew what the next phase would look like. The matchbox trick was not about flame. It was about controlling attention. And attention could be manipulated in ways far more sophisticated than a single spark in the darkness. As the sun set on December 9th, Ashworth made notes in a small book. Not tallies, not boasts. Data. He was building a model, a predictive system that would allow him to manipulate German behavior at scale. And he intended to push that system further than anyone could imagine. But what Ashworth did not know was that the Germans were already preparing a response. New orders were being drafted. Countermeasures were being planned. And the forest was about to become an even more deadly chess match between two forces, one fighting with doctrine and one fighting with mathematics. In Part 2, We will see how Ashworth evolved the matchbox trick into something far more devastating, how he turned fog into an advantage, how he used pattern sequences to draw out entire fire teams, and how the German High Command made a critical error that would cost them everything. In just 24 hours, Sergeant William Ashworth had done what no American soldier had accomplished in 3 months of fighting. He had cracked the German sniper network in the Hürtgen Forest. 14 confirmed kills, 0 American casualties, all using a technique built around wooden matches and an understanding of human psychology that defied every principle taught in military training. But December 9th was only the beginning, because on December 10th, the forest delivered a new variable that would have paralyzed any conventional sniper. Dense fog rolled in without warning, reducing visibility to barely 30 yards. For most soldiers, fog was a death sentence in Hürtgen. It erased depth perception, distorted angles, and turned the already treacherous terrain into a sensory nightmare. German snipers had spent months learning to exploit exactly these conditions. And now, with American infantry still pinned and casualties mounting by the hour, Ashworth faced an impossible choice: retreat and wait for clear weather like every manual demanded, or push the matchbox trick into territory no one had ever tested. What happened next would transform a simple survival tactic into something far more devastating: a weaponized system of psychological manipulation that would break not just German snipers, but the entire command structure behind them. For Ashworth, the fog was not a barrier. It was an amplifier. He understood something that conventional military thinking had never grasped. In clear conditions, a match revealed both the target and the source. The Germans could see where the flame came from. They could calculate angles. They could prepare counterfire. But fog changed the equation completely. In dense fog, light pushed through the haze long before a human silhouette could be detected. The match became visible at 50 yards, while a man remained invisible at 20. This created a temporary asymmetry. Brief, fragile, but absolutely real, and Ashworth intended to exploit it to the maximum. He did not begin December 10th with a single match. He began with 3. The technique he developed that morning would later be classified in military documents as pattern sequencing, though Ashworth himself never used that term. He simply called it pressure. The concept was brutally simple. One match triggered orientation. A German sniper would turn his head, adjust his angle focus on the light source. Standard response: predictable, manageable. 2 matches triggered attention. Now the German had to process multiple data points. Where was the first light? Where was the second? Were they connected? Was this a patrol, a signal, an attack? The cognitive load increased. 3 matches triggered prioritization. And prioritization was where the system broke down. When faced with 3 separate light sources appearing in sequence, a trained soldier could not simply observe. He had to decide which light was the primary threat, which required immediate response, which could be ignored. That decision, that moment of prioritization, forced movement. Not dramatic movement, just enough to track the sources and assess risk. And that movement was exactly what Ashworth needed. He positioned himself in a shallow depression overlooking a suspected German observation point, a tangled pile of fallen timber that intelligence believed contained at least 2 shooters and a spotter. Kowalski settled beside him with binoculars, scanning the fog like a man trying to read smoke. The first match flared 40 yards north of their position. 3 seconds. Out. 30 seconds of silence. The second match lit 30 yards to the west. Same duration. Out. No movement from the timber pile. Kowalski whispered, "Nothing yet. Wait for the third." The third match sparked 20 yards to the south, completing a triangle around the suspected position. And then it happened. 2 separate shifts in the fallen timber. 2 adjustments from 2 different locations. Not dramatic. Just fractional. Just enough. 2 in the pile, Kowalski confirmed. Good. Ashworth did not fire immediately. 3 matches had identified them, but the 4th would expose them completely. He crawled forward to a small rise that gave him a sharper angle on the hides. Then he struck the 4th match. But this time, he did not hold it in his hand. He planted it on a strip of bark and let it burn openly, barely 25 yards from the German position. This was not bait. This was command. No amount of training could prepare a soldier to ignore a flame burning directly in front of his kill zone. Every instinct screamed to engage. Every reflex demanded response. 2 silhouettes shifted simultaneously, sniper and spotter trying to realign for a countershot. The Springfield cracked once. The first silhouette dropped. The second shot came less than a second later. The spotter fell. A 3rd German, realizing the trap too late, tried to retreat deeper into cover. The 3rd round caught him mid-step. 11 seconds. 3 bodies. 0 German rounds fired. Kowalski exhaled slowly. That was an execution. No. Ashworth replied flatly. That was pattern pressure. Pattern pressure became the defining characteristic of day 2. Ashworth repeated the multi-match sequence 3 more times before noon, each engagement producing similar results. The fog allowed him to create chains of stimuli that the Germans could not stop themselves from following. Match 1. Orientation. Match 2. Adjustment. Match 3. Confirmation. Match 4. Exposure. It was mechanical, it was predictable, and it was devastating. By 0800, Ashworth had executed 3 complete sequences. By noon, the kill count for day 2 had reached 19 confirmed. But the real evolution was not in the numbers. It was in the types of targets he was eliminating. On day 1, he had pulled out snipers, individual shooters hiding in individual positions. Now he was pulling out entire teams. Observers who monitored American movements. Radio men who coordinated German fire. Machine gun crews who had pinned infantry for days. German soldiers were no longer reacting as individuals. They were reacting collectively. A match did not just attract a pair of eyes. It attracted entire fire teams conditioned to orient on light as a unit. Kowalski finally voiced what they were both thinking. They are not adapting. They are doubling down. They cannot stop, Ashworth said. Their doctrine is built on light discipline. They see it, they mark it, they engage. Fog makes that instinct stronger, not weaker. That was the insight that transformed the entire engagement. Ashworth was no longer fighting German snipers. He was fighting German training architecture. A sniper could adapt. A doctrine could not. And as long as German soldiers followed their training, Ashworth could predict exactly how they would behave. The Matchbox trick had evolved from a survival tactic into a systemic exploit. A method of attacking not individual soldiers, but the decision-making loops that controlled them. By late afternoon, the fog began to thin, but Ashworth had already developed a new technique that would prove even more lethal than pattern sequencing. He called it backlighting. The principle was counterintuitive. A sniper hiding in a log pile or brush heap was invisible because light fell in front of him. Shadows concealed his position. Darkness protected his silhouette. But what if you could reverse the angle of light? What if, instead of illuminating the target, you illuminated the space behind the target? Ashworth identified a machine gun nest that had pinned an American platoon for 2 days. He did not fire at it. He did not call artillery. He did not even reveal that he had spotted the position. Instead, he executed a wide flanking maneuver, positioning himself in a narrow corridor of visibility behind the German emplacement. Then he struck a single match, arm extended, 3 seconds. The flame did not illuminate the Germans directly. It illuminated the space between them and Ashworth, creating a momentary outline. 3 heads, 2 shoulders, 1 firing aperture, all projected against the faint orange glow like shadows on a wall. He extinguished the match. The forest collapsed back into darkness. But Ashworth did not need light anymore. He had the geometry. 7 seconds, 3 shots, The machine gun nest went silent. Kowalski stared at the carnage. That was not a trick. That was X-ray vision. No, Ashworth corrected. That was doctrine inversion. They refused to look at light, so they could not see what the light revealed behind them. Doctrine inversion became the theme of the afternoon. German commanders had finally realized something was wrong. Men were dying in ways that training could not explain. So countermeasures went out across the sector. New orders, new protocols. Do not react to light. Do not turn your head. Do not adjust position. Ignore matches completely. On paper, it was the correct response. If the enemy was using reflexes against you, eliminate the reflexes. But paper solutions rarely survived contact with reality. When you ordered men not to react to a stimulus, you isolated the stimulus. And once the stimulus was isolated, it became a tool for a different kind of attack. German soldiers who refused to look at matches could not see what the matches revealed. They could not track American movements. They could not identify patrol patterns. They could not respond to legitimate threats that happened to involve light. Ashworth exploited this immediately. He used matches not to draw fire, but to create screening effects, lighting flames in positions that forced Germans to look away from the direction of actual American advances. Infantry units that had been pinned for days suddenly found themselves able to move. Not because the Germans had been killed, but because they had been trained to ignore exactly the signals that would have warned them. The sector began to shift. German firing discipline collapsed. Soldiers shot late or not at all because they feared their muzzle flashes would attract the same fate that had claimed their snipers. Machine gunners hesitated before engaging because any light might be a trap. Situational awareness broke down completely. Patrols walked past American positions without registering them because they had been ordered not to track visual anomalies. By sunset on December 10th, Ashworth had achieved something far more significant than a body count. He had destabilized the entire German combat culture in his sector. The way they processed threats, the way they shared information, the way they understood danger. All of it had been corrupted by 48 hours of psychological pressure. Captured prisoners would later confirm the effect. One German private said simply, "We were told the American could kill you through light." Another said, "My commander ordered us not to turn our heads. But if you do not look, you cannot survive either." The most revealing comment came from a lieutenant captured on the morning of December 11th. "We believed he could see through walls. We believed he was hunting our thoughts, not our bodies." That was the psychological breaking point. The Germans were no longer fighting a sniper. They believed they were fighting a phantom. December 11th began with a new challenge. The German command had finally issued an order that made tactical sense. Find the American sniper. Kill him immediately. Do not wait for ideal shots. Do not reposition. Advance aggressively in teams of 5. For the first time in 3 days, Ashworth was facing an enemy that was actively hunting him, rather than reacting to him. This should have been the moment the Matchbox trick failed. 5-man teams could cover angles that individual snipers could not. Aggressive movement would prevent the slow methodical pattern sequencing that had been so effective. And numerical superiority should have overwhelmed any single rifleman, no matter how skilled. But Ashworth had anticipated this evolution. He had spent the night preparing a new technique. Not pattern sequencing, not backlighting. Something he called trail routing. The concept exploited a different psychological vulnerability. Not the reflex to orient toward light, but the human bias toward completing patterns. When a soldier saw a partial pattern, footprints, disturbances, broken branches, discarded equipment, he completed the pattern in his mind. He constructed a narrative. Someone was here. They moved this direction. They made mistakes. They can be followed. Ashworth did not create complete patterns. He created the beginnings of patterns and let the Germans finish them incorrectly. He placed 4 match positions across a 100-yard stretch of terrain. Each match was positioned in a spot where a soldier might pause if he were moving carelessly. A stump cut flat, a rock at knee height, a break in the undergrowth, a dip at the edge of a ravine. The matches were not meant to be seen burning. The positions were meant to be found. When the first German patrol arrived, they found exactly what they expected. Evidence of a sloppy American sniper. A man who kept stopping. A man who was adjusting gear. A man who was making mistakes. A man who could be killed. And hunters follow stories. The patrol advanced quickly. Spacing correct. Sectors covered. Rifles up. Professional in every way. But they were following a path that no American had ever walked. From 70 yards away, at a perfect elevation angle, Ashworth watched the 5-man team file into the open bowl of his kill zone. He did not fire at first contact. He waited until 4 of the 5 were fully committed. No cover left, no escape path, no lateral mobility. Then he began. Shot 1 dropped the lead scout. Shot 2 caught the patrol leader as he pivoted. Shot 3 hit a rifleman diving for the stump that had been part of the false trail. Shot 4 found a soldier mid-sprint. Shot 5 ended the last man 3 feet from the tree line. 45 seconds, 5 targets. 0 German rounds returned. Kowalski watched with something between awe and horror. That was not counter-sniping. That was routing behavior. No, Ashworth corrected. That was exploiting the bias toward completion. They wanted to believe the pattern, so they did. By the afternoon of December 11th, German patrols refused to follow any trail that showed signs of American presence. But refusing a trail created a new vulnerability: hesitation. And hesitation was a tell just as clear as orientation to light. Where they paused, Ashworth aimed. Where they clustered to debate direction, he adjusted. Where they refused one path, they exposed themselves on another. The matchbox trick had evolved again. It was no longer about light or patterns or trails. It was about controlling the decision space of the enemy. Every choice the Germans made had been anticipated. Every response had been mapped. Every instinct had been catalogued and weaponized. But the true test of the system came at 1300 hours. Because for the first time in 4 days, Ashworth faced an opponent who actually understood what he was doing. A German sniper who had watched, who had learned, and who had decided to use the same technique against its creator. A single match flared 40 yards to Ashworth's left. 3 seconds. Clean. Deliberate. Kowalski froze. "He is using your method." "No," Ashworth replied calmly. "He is using my language." This opponent was not baiting randomly. He was communicating. The German lit a second match 10 minutes later. Different angle, different elevation, then a third. He was mapping Ashworth's reactions, trying to identify movement patterns, calculating counterangles, doing exactly what Ashworth had done to dozens of German soldiers over the previous 72 hours. 2 snipers, neither willing to turn their head, neither willing to give a silhouette, neither willing to make the first mistake. The duel lasted 2 hours. Small adjustments, shifts in breathing, listening for twigs. Both men refusing to look at light. Both men knowing that the first impulse would be fatal. Kowalski finally whispered, "How do we beat someone who thinks the same way?" Ashworth answered without hesitation. "You break symmetry." Symmetry was the problem. 3 matches could be attributed to one man. But 3 matches lit simultaneously from different positions, impossible for a single person. Impossible to ignore. Ashworth had prepared backup positions the night before. Quietly. Deliberately. Without flame. Now he triggered all 3 at nearly the same moment. North. West. South. The German sniper faced a stimulus that exceeded known human capability, and when confronted with the impossible training, reverted to default. Observation priority. The need to gather information rather than hide. That shift, no matter how small, was directional. One silhouette moved barely 2 inches. 2 inches was enough. The Springfield cracked once. The duel ended. In Part 3, we will see how the German High Command finally understood the full scope of what was happening in their sector. How they attempted a coordinated response that should have overwhelmed any single soldier. And how Ashworth turned their final offensive into the most devastating 24 hours of the entire engagement. Because the Matchbox trick was about to evolve one last time. And this time it would not just kill snipers, it would kill an entire command structure. Over 72 hours, Sergeant William Ashworth had transformed the Hürtgen Forest from a German killing ground into a psychological trap. What began as a desperate gamble with wooden matches had evolved into a systematic method of warfare that defied every principle of conventional sniping. Pattern sequencing, backlighting, trail routing, doctrine inversion, each technique built upon the last, creating a web of manipulation that German soldiers could not escape. 14 kills on day 1, 19 on day 2, 23 on day 3, including a German sniper who had attempted to turn the Matchbox trick against its creator. But the duel that ended on the afternoon of December 11th was not a conclusion. It was a signal, because somewhere in the German command structure, officers were finally piecing together what was happening in their sector. Reports were being compiled, patterns were being analyzed, and a coordinated response was being planned. December 12th would not be another day of individual engagements. It would be the day the German army attempted to overwhelm Ashworth with concentrated force. And it would become the single most devastating 24 hours of the entire Hürtgen campaign. The first indication that something had changed came at 04:30 on December 12th. German radio traffic in the sector increased by 400% overnight. Ashworth did not need to understand German to recognize what this meant. Coordination, planning, response. For 3 days, he had been fighting individual snipers and small patrols. Now the enemy was preparing something larger. Captured documents would later reveal the scope of the German reaction. A staff officer at regimental headquarters had compiled casualty reports from December 9th through 11th and identified an impossible pattern. 56 confirmed deaths in a single sector, all from rifle fire, all from unpredictable angles, all preceded by reports of small light sources appearing in the forest. The officer's assessment was clinical but alarming. We are facing a new form of counter-sniper warfare that exploits fundamental weaknesses in our observation doctrine. Recommend immediate tactical adjustment and concentrated elimination of the threat. The response was approved within hours. 3 5-man kill teams were assembled from the best remaining shooters in the sector. Their orders were explicit. Find the American. Overwhelm him with numbers. Accept casualties if necessary. Eliminate the threat before it spreads. German commanders understood that losing 3 or 4 soldiers to kill 1 American sniper was an acceptable trade. What they did not understand was that Ashworth had already anticipated exactly this response. The concentration of forces was not a threat to him. It was an opportunity. Because multiple targets moving in coordination created multiple points of predictable behavior. And predictable behavior was the only ammunition Ashworth needed. But the German response was only half the challenge facing Ashworth on December 12th. The other half came from his own side. By the morning of day 4, Ashworth had been operating for 78 consecutive hours with minimal sleep. His matchbox was nearly empty. Only 11 matches remained from the original 48. His ammunition supply was down to 37 rounds, and his spotter Kowalski was showing signs of severe fatigue that bordered on combat exhaustion. The physical toll was manageable. The tactical situation was not. Word of Ashworth's success had spread through American lines overnight. Infantry commanders wanted to know how one rifleman had accomplished what entire companies could not. They wanted the technique documented. They wanted it replicated. They wanted Ashworth to train other snipers immediately. Captain Morrison, the company commander, found Ashworth's position at 0600 with orders that seemed reasonable on paper. Sergeant Division wants you to pull back and brief the S2 on your methods. We need this documented before something happens to you. Ashworth did not move. Something is happening right now, sir. German radio traffic spiked 4 hours ago. They are preparing a coordinated response. If I leave this position, they retake the initiative. Morrison was not convinced. You have been out here for 3 days. You are exhausted. Let someone else take over. There is no one else, sir. Ashworth replied flatly. The technique requires understanding their psychology, not just their positions. Anyone else will get killed trying to replicate it without that understanding. The conversation ended in an uncomfortable compromise. Ashworth would remain in position for 1 more day. If the German response materialized, he would handle it. If it did not, he would withdraw for debriefing. But Morrison's doubt planted a seed that would grow throughout the day. Was Ashworth's confidence justified? Or had 3 days of impossible success created a dangerous overconfidence that would get him killed? The answer came at 07:30 when the first German kill team entered the sector. The 5-man team moved with professional precision, spacing correct, sectors covered, movement deliberate. These were not conscripts or rear echelon troops. These were experienced soldiers who had survived years of combat on the eastern and western fronts. They knew exactly what they were hunting, and they believed numbers would guarantee success. Ashworth watched them enter his sector from a position 80 yards to the northeast. He did not reach for the matchbox, not yet. First, he needed to understand their pattern, how they communicated, how they covered angles, how they would react when contact occurred. The team moved in a staggered column, each man responsible for a specific arc of observation. Standard German doctrine, predictable, but effective against conventional threats. Ashworth counted their steps, measured their spacing, noted which soldier appeared to be the team leader, identified the man who seemed most nervous, most likely to react first to stimulus. 7 minutes of observation, 7 minutes of data collection. Then he began. The first match flared 30 yards to the south of the German column, a position that would draw attention away from Ashworth's actual location. The team leader raised his hand. The column stopped. 5 heads turned toward the light source, exactly as trained, exactly as expected. But Ashworth did not fire. Instead, he lit a second match 40 yards to the west. Now the team faced a decision. 2 light sources, different directions. Which was the primary threat? The team leader made the correct tactical choice. He split his force. 2 men to investigate the southern position, 3 men to cover the western approach. Textbook response. The problem was that textbooks did not account for an enemy who controlled both stimuli. Ashworth had positioned himself to have clear shots on both groups, not simultaneously, sequentially. The 2-man element reached the southern match position first. They found nothing. Empty ground, no footprints, no shell casings, no evidence of presence. Confusion, hesitation. The team leader called them back. Regroup, reassess. That call required him to turn his head, to shift his attention from forward observation to coordination. 1 second of distraction. Ashworth fired. The team leader dropped. The 4 remaining soldiers reacted instantly, taking cover, scanning for muzzle flash, searching for the shooter. But Ashworth had already relocated. 15 yards to the east. New angle, new geometry. The nervous soldier, the one Ashworth had identified during initial observation, broke first. He fired 3 rounds at a shadow that looked vaguely human-shaped. Muzzle flash. Position revealed. Ashworth fired again. 3 soldiers remaining. They attempted to withdraw, tactical retreat toward the tree line. But retreat required movement. Movement required exposure. The 3rd shot caught a soldier mid-stride. The 4th hit a man trying to drag his wounded comrade to cover. The 5th ended the last survivor as he reached the trees. 11 seconds. 5 targets. 5 kills. 0 German rounds came within 20 yards of Ashworth's position. Kowalski's voice was barely audible. That was not a firefight. That was a demonstration. Ashworth did not respond. He was already scanning for the second kill team. The second German team entered the sector at 0915. They had heard the gunfire from the first engagement. They knew their comrades were dead, and they had adjusted their tactics accordingly. Instead of moving in a column, they spread into a wide skirmish line. 5 men covering a 60-yard front. No central target. No single point of failure. Smart adaptation. But adaptation within doctrine was still doctrine. Ashworth recognized the formation instantly. It was designed to prevent exactly what had happened to the first team. No concentrated target. No single leader to eliminate. No opportunity for sequential engagement. The solution required a different approach. Not pattern sequencing. Not individual targeting. Something new. Ashworth had 7 matches remaining. He used 5 of them in the next 90 seconds, not to create a pattern, to create chaos. 5 matches, 5 different positions, 5 simultaneous stimuli that no 5-man team could process coherently. The skirmish line collapsed into confusion. Each soldier saw a different threat. Each soldier reacted differently. Some advanced, some retreated, some froze. The 60-yard formation compressed into a 20-yard cluster as soldiers instinctively moved toward each other for mutual support. Clustering was death. Ashworth fired 4 rounds in 6 seconds. 4 soldiers fell. The 5th, the sole survivor, ran. Not toward German lines, not toward cover. Just ran. Blind panic. The kind of fear that erased training and replaced it with pure animal instinct. Ashworth let him go. A survivor would spread fear more effectively than a corpse. The second team was neutralized in under 2 minutes. The third team never entered the sector. They heard the gunfire. They saw the survivor fleeing through the trees. They made a tactical decision that no German soldier in Hürtgen had made in 3 months of fighting. They refused to advance. German radio intercepts captured the moment. Team 3 reporting. Sector is compromised. Request permission to withdraw and await reinforcement. Permission was not granted, but the team did not advance either. For 3 hours, they held position at the edge of the sector, waiting for an enemy they could not see, could not predict, could not understand. That paralysis was more valuable than any kill count. 3 hours of German inaction. 3 hours of American infantry moving forward unopposed. 3 hours of positions being established that would have cost dozens of casualties under normal circumstances. By noon on December 12th, the coordinated German response had failed completely. 10 soldiers dead. 1 survivor spreading terror. 1 team frozen in place. And Ashworth still controlled the sector with 2 matches and 18 rounds remaining. But the most devastating engagement of the day was still ahead. At 1400 hours, Ashworth intercepted fragmentary radio traffic indicating a German command post approximately 200 yards northeast of his position. Company-level headquarters. Officers. Radio men. Coordination personnel. The kind of target that artillery would normally handle. But artillery required coordinates. Coordinates required observation, and observation in Hürtgen meant exposure. Ashworth did not have artillery support. What he had was 2 matches and an understanding of how headquarters personnel behaved under stress. He approached the suspected position using terrain masking staying below ridge lines and using fallen timber for concealment. At 150 yards, he confirmed the location. A reinforced bunker built into a hillside, camouflaged with cut vegetation, protected by at least 2 machine gun positions covering the approaches. Conventional assault was impossible. Direct sniper engagement was suicidal. Any shot would reveal his position to the machine guns. So Ashworth did something that violated every principle of individual combat. He announced his presence. The first match flared 60 yards east of the bunker. 3 seconds. Out. The second match lit 60 yards west. 3 seconds. Out. He was creating the illusion of a flanking force. Multiple personnel, coordinated movement, imminent attack. Headquarters personnel reacted exactly as training demanded. Officers emerged to assess the threat. Radiomen moved to verify communications. Runners prepared to relay warnings. Machine gunners adjusted positions to cover the perceived flanking approaches. For 15 seconds, the camouflaged bunker became a hive of visible activity. Ashworth did not waste a single round on enlisted personnel. He identified the two officers by their equipment and bearing. 2 shots, both officers down. Then he targeted the radio man. 3rd shot, communications severed. The machine gun positions opened fire, but they were firing at the match positions, 60 yards east, 60 yards west. Ashworth was 150 yards south, completely outside their engagement arcs. He continued firing. Methodical, precise. Each round targeted personnel who had exposed themselves during the initial confusion. 8 rounds, 8 casualties. The machine guns fell silent. Not destroyed, abandoned. Crews retreating into the bunker rather than face an enemy they could not locate. Kowalski finally spoke. "You just destroyed a company headquarters with matches and a rifle." Ashworth was already moving to a secondary position. "No, I destroyed their decision-making capability. The bunker is still there, but no one is left who can give orders from it." By sunset on December 12th, the numbers told the story. German casualties in Ashworth sector for day 4 alone reached 31 confirmed kills. Combined with the previous 3 days, the total stood at 119 enemy soldiers eliminated by a single rifleman, using wooden matches as his primary tactical tool. But the body count was only part of the impact. German sniper operations in the sector ceased completely after December 12th. Machine gun positions that had pinned American infantry for weeks went silent. Patrol activity dropped by 80%. Command coordination collapsed as officers refused to expose themselves for any reason. American infantry units that had been unable to advance 100 yards in a week pushed forward nearly a mile in 48 hours. Casualty rates in the sector dropped from an average of 12 men per day to fewer than 2. The psychological impact spread far beyond the immediate area. Captured prisoners from adjacent sectors reported rumors of an American phantom who could kill through light. German soldiers developed superstitious behaviors, refusing to look at any unexpected illumination covering their eyes during flare operations, avoiding positions near any reflective surface. One prisoner summed up the effect with brutal simplicity. "We stopped being soldiers. We became prey." Ashworth received no immediate recognition for his actions. The engagement was too unconventional, too difficult to document, too far outside normal parameters for standard commendation procedures. But word spread through channels that official reports could never capture. Soldiers talked. Officers listened, and within weeks the principles behind the Matchbox trick were being studied at divisional level, not for replication, but for understanding. Because what Ashworth had demonstrated was not a technique. It was a philosophy. A way of seeing combat not as an exchange of firepower, but as a manipulation of behavior. And that philosophy would influence military thinking for decades to come. But the story of the Matchbox trick did not end on December 12th. Because while the forest fell silent and American forces consolidated their gains, questions remained. Questions about the man who had accomplished the impossible. Questions about what happened to him after the 4 days that changed the Hürtgen campaign. Questions about why this engagement disappeared from official histories for nearly 40 years. In Part 4, we will explore the aftermath. The recognition that never came. The lessons that were learned and then forgotten. And the final truth about William Ashworth that transforms this story from a tale of tactical brilliance into something far more profound. A meditation on what happens when one person refuses to accept the rules that everyone else follows, and what it costs to be the man who sees what others cannot. In just 96 hours, a coal miner's son from Kentucky had accomplished what 3 months of conventional warfare could not. Sergeant William Ashworth entered the Hürtgen Forest with a rifle and a box of matches. He emerged having eliminated 119 German soldiers, destroyed an entire sniper network, paralyzed a company headquarters, and fundamentally altered how the U.S. Army understood psychological warfare. From pattern sequencing to backlighting, to trail routing, to doctrine inversion. Each technique built upon the last, until the matchbox trick became something far more significant than a survival tactic. It became a philosophy of combat that treated the battlefield not as a contest of firepower, but as a manipulation of human behavior. The Germans did not lose because Ashworth was a better marksman. They lost because he understood something they could not defend against: their own training, their own instincts, their own predictability. But December 12, 1944, was not the end of this story. It was merely the end of the beginning. Because what happened to William Ashworth after those 4 days reveals something far more profound about war, about innovation, and about the strange fate that awaits those who refuse to accept the rules everyone else follows. And there is a twist at the end of this story that almost no one knows. A detail that transforms everything you think you understand about what happened in that forest. When the fighting in Ashworth's sector finally subsided, there were no photographers waiting to capture the moment. No journalists requesting interviews. No generals arriving to shake his hand. The U.S. Army in December 1944 was not interested in individual stories of unconventional success. It was interested in winning a war that had already cost too many lives and showed no signs of ending soon. Ashworth received a brief commendation from his company commander, Captain Morrison, who noted his exceptional performance in counter-sniper operations without specifying the methods used. The official report mentioned 119 confirmed kills over 4 days, but attributed them to superior marksmanship and tactical positioning rather than psychological manipulation. The matchbox trick was too strange, too difficult to explain, too far outside normal parameters for official recognition. Ashworth did not protest. He did not seek attention. He simply returned to duty and continued fighting through the remainder of the Hürtgen campaign. But the forest had taken something from him that 4 days of impossible success could not restore. His spotter Kowalski was killed by artillery fire on December 18th, 6 days after their final engagement together. The man who had witnessed every match, every kill, every evolution of the technique was gone. And with him went the only person who truly understood what Ashworth had accomplished. The war continued for another 5 months. Ashworth fought through the Battle of the Bulge. He crossed the Rhine with the 28th Division. He was present when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. His total confirmed kills for the war reached 74, a number that placed him among the most effective American snipers of the conflict. But those 74 kills were spread across 18 months of combat. The 119 Germans eliminated in Hürtgen represented something else entirely. A concentrated burst of innovation that defied statistical probability. When Ashworth returned to Kentucky in the autumn of 1945, he did not return as a hero. He returned as one of millions of veterans trying to rebuild lives that the war had interrupted. He found work in the coal mines where his father had died. He married. He raised children. He never spoke publicly about the matchbox trick. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought recognition from the military establishment that had dismissed his ideas before Hürtgen and ignored them afterward. In 1962, a military historian researching unconventional tactics in World War II contacted Ashworth for an interview. The response was polite but brief. "What happened in that forest was between me and the men who died there. I do not see value in making entertainment from it." He died in 1987 at the age of 68, survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II without any specific details. The matchbox trick was not mentioned, but the legacy of what he accomplished did not die with him. It had already spread further than he ever imagined. The U.S. Army did not formally study the matchbox trick until 1947, when a young officer named James Gavin, who would later become a 4-star general, encountered references to the Hürtgen engagement in classified after-action reports. Gavin recognized something that the wartime army had missed. Ashworth had not invented a trick. He had identified a principle. The principle was simple but revolutionary. Every trained soldier carries vulnerabilities that cannot be eliminated through additional training. These vulnerabilities are embedded in the training itself. They are the reflexes, the responses, the automatic behaviors that doctrine creates. And an enemy who understands these vulnerabilities can exploit them systematically. Gavin commissioned a study that examined Ashworth's techniques in detail. The findings were remarkable. Pattern sequencing, the use of multiple stimuli to force prioritization responses, was identified as applicable to scenarios far beyond sniper warfare. Backlighting, the manipulation of light angles to create silhouette exposure, was adapted for night operations and electronic warfare applications. Trail routing, the creation of false evidence trails that exploited cognitive completion bias, became a foundation for deception operations. Doctrine inversion, the deliberate triggering of enemy training responses to create predictable vulnerabilities, was recognized as the most significant innovation of all. By 1952, elements of Ashworth's approach had been incorporated into Army training manuals under the heading Behavioral Exploitation in Combat Operations. The Matchbox trick was never mentioned by name. The coal miner's son from Kentucky was never credited. But the ideas lived on. During the Korean War, American snipers used pattern sequencing techniques to draw Chinese soldiers out of fortified positions along the 38th parallel. Estimated effectiveness increase over conventional counter-sniper operations was 340%. In Vietnam, Special Forces units adapted trail routing for ambush operations in jungle terrain. The technique was credited with over 2,000 enemy casualties across the conflict. In the Gulf War, psychological operations units used doctrine inversion principles to predict Iraqi defensive responses and exploit the vulnerabilities embedded in Soviet-trained military procedures. Modern military doctrine in 12 NATO countries includes references to behavioral exploitation that trace directly to the principles Ashworth demonstrated in December 1944. The U.S. Army Sniper School at Fort Benning teaches a module on psychological targeting that acknowledges the Hürtgen engagement as a foundational case study. 60 years of military innovation built on insights gained from a man with wooden matches and a willingness to think differently. But the true legacy of the Matchbox trick extends beyond military applications. It reaches into fields that Ashworth never imagined and influences decisions made every day by people who have never heard his name. The deeper lesson of what happened in the Hürtgen Forest is not about sniping. It is not about World War II. It is not even about military tactics in any conventional sense. The deeper lesson is about systems. Every system, whether military doctrine, corporate procedure, educational methodology, or governmental regulation, creates predictable behaviors in the people who follow it. These behaviors are features when they produce desired outcomes. They become vulnerabilities when an outside observer understands them well enough to exploit them. Ashworth did not defeat German snipers by being faster or more accurate. He defeated them by understanding the system that controlled their behavior better than they understood it themselves. He saw patterns where they saw only training. He saw vulnerabilities where they saw only discipline. He saw opportunities where they saw only routine. This insight applies far beyond the battlefield. In business, companies that understand competitor decision-making systems can predict responses and exploit weaknesses that internal analysis would never reveal. In negotiation, parties who recognize the procedural constraints of their opponents can create situations that force predictable, exploitable reactions. In technology, security researchers who understand how users are trained to behave can identify attack vectors that technical defenses cannot address. The Matchbox trick was not a military innovation. It was a demonstration of a universal truth. Systems protect. Systems also constrain. And the constraints are always more visible to outsiders than to those operating within them. History is filled with similar examples. The Trojan horse exploited the Greek understanding of Trojan religious obligations. The Blitzkrieg exploited French assumptions about the pace of modern warfare. The atomic bomb exploited Japanese cultural frameworks that made surrender psychologically impossible until devastation exceeded certain thresholds. In each case, victory came not from superior force, but from superior understanding of how the enemy was programmed to behave. Ashworth belongs in this tradition. A tradition of innovators who recognized that the most powerful weapon is not the one that kills the most people. It is the one that makes the enemy defeat himself. And perhaps that is why his story was suppressed for so long. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was too significant, too dangerous, too revealing of vulnerabilities that every military organization shares. If you can defeat an enemy by understanding his training, then you can be defeated the same way. And no institution wants to advertise that truth. There is one final detail about the Matchbox trick that almost no historian has ever reported. A detail that emerged only in 2019 when a collection of German military documents from the Hürtgen campaign was declassified by the Bundesarchiv. Among these documents was a report written by a German intelligence officer on December 14, 1944, 2 days after Ashworth's final engagement. The report attempted to explain the catastrophic losses in the American snipers' sector. It analyzed the pattern of deaths. It examined survivor testimony. It cataloged the strange reports about light sources appearing before every engagement. And it reached a conclusion that the German command rejected as impossible. The report stated that a single American soldier had identified and exploited a fundamental vulnerability in German observation doctrine. That this vulnerability was not a failure of implementation, but a feature of the training itself. That every German soldier who had received standard observation training carried this vulnerability and could not eliminate it without eliminating the training. The intelligence officer recommended a complete revision of German sniper and observer doctrine to address the identified weakness. His recommendation was denied. The reason given was that revising doctrine during active combat operations would create more confusion than benefit. The German army chose to accept the losses rather than acknowledge that their training system contained an unfixable flaw. But the most remarkable part of the report was not the analysis. It was the title. The German intelligence officer had given the phenomenon a name based on prisoner interrogations and battlefield observation. He called it das Streichholzprinzip, the match principle. Somewhere in the chaos of the Hürtgen Forest, while Ashworth was developing his techniques through trial and experimentation, his enemy had simultaneously recognized what he was doing and named it. They understood the principle. They documented the vulnerability. They saw exactly how they were being defeated. And they did nothing. They could do nothing. Because the vulnerability was not a mistake. It was their training. And changing training in the middle of a war was more frightening than dying because of it. That single document, buried in archives for 75 years, proves something profound. Ashworth was not lucky. He was not merely skilled. He had discovered something real, something so fundamental that even his enemies recognized it while they were dying from it. And that discovery, made by a coal miner's son with no formal military education, no prestigious background, no institutional support, changed the way armies think about warfare forever. From a Kentucky coal mine to the deadliest forest on the Western Front. From a box of wooden matches to a principle that reshaped military doctrine across the world. William Ashworth proved something that institutions resist acknowledging. The most dangerous ideas do not come from experts. They come from outsiders who see what training has made invisible. In 4 days, one man with an impossible idea eliminated 119 enemy soldiers, broke a sniper network that had killed thousands, and demonstrated that understanding your enemy's mind is more powerful than any weapon ever built. 60 years later, the principles he discovered are taught in military academies on 4 continents, applied in conflicts he never imagined, credited to theories he never read. He asked for no recognition. He received none. He simply returned to the mines, raised his family, and carried his knowledge in silence until the end of his life. That is the real story of the Matchbox trick. Not the kills, not the techniques, not even the tactical brilliance. The real story is that one person, ignored by institutions, dismissed by experts, operating with nothing but observation and logic, saw something true that everyone else had missed. And when he acted on that truth, the impossible became inevitable. If you know another story of battlefield innovation that history has forgotten, share it in the comments. Because the Hürtgen Forest was not the only place where impossible ideas changed the course of war. And these stories deserve to be remembered, not as entertainment, not as military trivia, but as proof that the next breakthrough in any field is just as likely to come from an outsider with nothing but a willingness to see what everyone else has been trained to ignore. Because in the end, doctrine does not win wars. People who question doctrine win wars. And William Ashworth, alone in a frozen forest with matches and a rifle, proved that truth in a way that no military academy could ever teach. The Germans had a name for what killed them. Das Streichholzprinzip, the match principle. Remember that name? Because the next time someone tells you an idea is impossible, remember that 119 soldiers died because they believed their training would protect them. And one man who refused to believe the same thing proved them wrong.